The city woke under a sky the color of cold steel, a Vancouver morning that smelled of rain and cut cedar. Freight horns moaned along Burrard Inlet as gulls wheeled above the cranes, and a wet wind pushed the harbor's breath inland through rows of glass towers. In that wind, a woman climbed the narrow staircase of a brick building that had once housed a cooperage and now held her family's empire. Her boots tracked sawdust like a breadcrumb trail across a polished corridor, and her heart marched to the same rhythm as the planer knives she had learned to tune by ear. The moment she reached the frosted glass door to the executive office, the life she had accepted humble, unrecognized, useful, split like end grain under a dull blade. Within the room she was not meant to enter. The voices of power moved with the careless certainty of men who believed their decisions to be weather rather than choice. In that static-laced air, she heard the plan to carve off a quarter of the company for a sister who had never smelled the kiln or learned the weight of green Douglas fir in the hands. She heard the time-box schedule designed to outrun a birthday that mattered, because a dead man's words had promised a living woman what she had already earned. She heard herself described as a pair of hands without a head, a worker, not an executive, a whisper meant to stick like resin to a reputation and harden into disqualification. The woman's name was Rowan Tran, Sage, and though her surname came by way of a refugee boat and a small grocery in Burnaby, her craft came from 10,000 hours of listening to wood until it spoke back. She left the door like a ghost, moving through hallways that displayed framed photographs of dignitaries shaking hands with her father. Beyond the glass wall, the rain thickened, beating on the branches of young red cedar planted in steel planters to suggest a respect for forests that the family name had traded like shares. She descended past the floors of sales and finance and human resources, where every desk held a screen but no one knew the sound a mill makes when a blade begins to wander. The elevator opened into the production level of Coast Crown timber, where the air was warm and wet and smelled like the inside of a living tree. Forklifts threaded yellow lines, and the long lungs of the dust collection system inhaled and exhaled above the steady thrum. Here, men and women lifted gloved hands to her without looking up, the way a crew salutes a captain who is not marked by epaulets but by the way a ship keeps its keel. From the catwalk, Rowan watched the arc of the line she had reconfigured the previous autumn to reduce fallback and snipe. The numbers had proven what her body already knew: less waste, more yields, fewer stoppages. In the weekly metrics emailed to the executive floor, a different name had been typed in the cell labeled responsible, a habit as old as her childhood. There had always been an older sister. There had always been a mother who could convert pride to policy with a serene smile. There had always been a father who adored results and distrusted the hands that produced them. The family story celebrated the one who returned from Montreal with an MBA and clean shoes and a love of keynote slides. The family story tolerated the one who returned from Prince George with a back that stiffened when the weather changed and a love of lumber so fierce it sometimes frightened her. Rowan allowed herself one small moment to feel the cut, the heat, the sting. Then she walked the deck. She tested a fence that had drifted a millimeter out of square. She listened to the alignment rollers and noted a rumor of vibration that foretold a bearings complaint. She tightened a habit into a plan and made a plan into a list, and by the time she finished, the ache in her chest had transformed into something useful. On her way back to a windowless office that smelled of coffee and damp paper, she paused by the break table and saw the flyer announcing a charity gala at a Cole Harbor hotel, the kind of event where her sister would look perfect beside her father. The flyer used words like legacy and stewardship in a serif font. Rowan touched the edge of the paper and considered how words like that feel in the mouth when spoken honestly, and how they sound when used to excuse a theft. That evening, she did what the careful do when they are being cornered by the reckless. She went to the records that sit quietly while louder men tell lies. She used her badge at an hour when security was a single drowsy man with a crossword and a sandwich. In the server room, under the hum of climate control, she assembled the breadcrumb trail they had always credited to someone else. She traced variance curves to the week the new moisture algorithm went live. She mapped production surges to the installation of a fence she had designed on a yellow pad and cut on a Sunday with a friend's plasma table. She gathered work orders and training logs and shift emails, and as each piece clicked into the next, a picture emerged that even a lawyer would have to respect. Old paper lived in another room, and for that, she had to ask the past for help. The past obliged. Her grandfather had loved carbon copies and had taught Rowan to write daily notes on a yellow legal pad that she filed every Friday in a banker's box labeled with the week's dates. The notes did not seek to impress anyone. They sought only to remember. They recorded the rough grain of a contract negotiation with a millwork firm in Victoria, the pitch of the planers after a blade swap when the room grew warmer, the way the new kid on night shift loosened his shoulders after she showed him an easier lift. Stacked. The boxes formed a small wall of 6 years. She began to read, and her own handwriting returned to her like a witness she didn't know she had. She needed more than records. She needed truth-tellers. In a city where timber fortunes had built glass penthouses and generous endowments, truth had learned to stay quiet to keep its job, but one voice had not forgiven the quiet it had been forced to swallow. Maya Desjardins, a safety specialist who had refused to file a report that turned a near miss into nothing, had been thanked for her service and shown the door one winter afternoon when the rain was coming down sideways along the North Shore. Rumor said Maya had a cabin in Squamish and a filing cabinet of copies a careful woman would make when the careless ordered her to forget. Rowan drove an hour along the sea-to-sky highway the next day, where Howe Sound was slate and whitecaps and the granite flanks of the Stiwamus Chief rose like a scripture. In a kitchen that smelled of wet wool and strong tea, 2 women compared notes while ravens made commentary in the pines. The documents on Maya's table were as relentless as water on stone. There were WorkSafe BC citations that had been resolved through a choreography familiar to any industry that learns to dance around the rules. There were effluent test results during high-output months that had been massaged into compliance by the magic of missing samples. There were overtime sheets that had somehow shrunk crossing a manager's desk. There were emails filled with phrases like, "Can we make this go away and try not to get legal involved?" The papers were not a story. They were a shape of wrongdoing engraved on time. Rowan left the cabin with a cardboard file box buckled into the passenger seat and a partnership that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. A person can spend a long time keeping their head down and then one morning wake with a neck that refuses to bend. The morning after Squamish. Rowan woke with such a neck, she looked at the ceiling of her East Van walk-up where the plaster cracked like a dry riverbed above the stove, and she thought about the men on the floor who had begun to look to her before looking to posted directives. She thought about the email she had received from a client whose custom order had been rescued by her decision to run a waste lot through a different sequence. He had praised the company. She had replied with thanks and said nothing about her hands. She thought about a sentence in the will she had read in her grandfather's own writing, the sentence that did not care for titles but worshipped outcomes. By lunch, her jaw had unclenched. By 3, she had called a lawyer whose reputation in Vancouver was for building cases like seawalls straight, high, and not easy to go around. The law has its tempo, and those who live by production schedules find it slow, but some machines are faster, ma'am. In the shadow of the Lions Gate Bridge, on a small industrial lot that smelled of rust and rain, Rowan and Maya rented space and rolled a portable bandsaw mill into place beside a stack of salvaged cedar logs from a windfall on the Sunshine Coast. They set a small solar kiln to gather heat even in a stingy spring. They named nothing and marketed nothing. They simply cut true and dried slow. The wood that came out of their care had a calm to it, a lack of tension that made joinery ring instead of squeal. A furniture maker in Strathcona noticed. A violin shop near Granville Island ran a hand across a billet and told other hands. A cafe on Main Street asked for a counter that would feel like a river. At night, Rowan still walked Coast Crown's line, but she also walked the grain of boards that owed nothing to her father. One Friday, a letter on a partner's letterhead went by courier to a boardroom decorated with prints of forests photographed from helicopters. The letter did not indulge in adjectives. It recorded facts in an order that made their meaning unavoidable. It attached exhibits and listed statutes. It included a request grounded in a will that Vancouver society had once celebrated for its wisdom, a will that had become inconvenient to those who had assumed they could interpret outcomes to match their ambitions. The letter proposed a meeting on the top floor of the brick building where everything had begun. It offered dates and noted that if the meeting did not occur, a different kind of meeting would happen in a different kind of room, with different consequences and a different audience. Yuck. On the day chosen, the rain paused and left the city shining. Rowan wore a charcoal suit that remembered its hanger too well, and boots that remembered real work. She carried a leather folio with a tendon along the spine where it had been gripped tightly by other hands who had argued harder causes. She rode an elevator with a florist's cart draped in white orchids bound for a gala. In the corridor, she passed portraits of the founder, her grandfather, standing in a landscape where the trees were so large a man looked like a punctuation mark against them. She paused under glass and thought not of blood or surnames, but of the gaze in the old man's eyes. It was a gaze that belonged to a craftsperson more than a patriarch. The door to the boardroom was heavy and apologetic. It closed behind her with the soft exhale of money. Rowan did not rehearse the sentences she had lived for years. She put the folio on the table and released the mechanism that keeps paper from spilling. The pages did what they were made to do. They spoke in a voice everyone in the room had to acknowledge because it was not a voice that could flatter or be flattered, but it was a voice that adds and subtracts and arrives at a sum. The sum was not good for those who had believed they could deny outcomes while pretending to defend them. There were numbers married to dates and initials married to actions and test results married to permit limits. There were photographs of guards taken off machines to speed a deadline, then put back on the week an inspector walked through. There were memos signed by people who had moved to other companies but left their scrawl behind like footprints in wet cement. At the back, there was a copy of a paragraph written by a man who had known he would not live to attend this meeting, and a paragraph that linked an age and a set of metrics to a gift whose justice would be obvious to anyone who had walked the floor. The conversation tried to become family. It tried to suggest hurt feelings and misunderstandings, to wrap itself in holiday dinners and home movies. Rowan kept it from that. She declined to discuss birthdays except the one that mattered to the will. She declined to discuss envy except the kind that corrodes safety practices. She did not accuse, she presented. When it was suggested that going public would harm the company, she agreed and then observed that nothing harms a ship more than the captain drilling holes while denying the sea exists. The meeting did not end with hugs. It ended with resolutions as drafted by counsel who now spoke differently to the men they had assumed would never need to listen. It ended with a special board vote that acknowledged what outcomes had already made true 30% voting shares transferred as the will required, a compliance plan with dates that would be checked not by hopes but by third-party audits, and a leadership structure that called an operator what she was someone who leads by making the line run safely and well. Vancouver noticed. Industry press in Burnaby wrote friendly profiles that used words like grit and authenticity. The men Rowan worked beside went back to work and did not mention the articles, which was the only congratulations she wanted. Her mother sent an email that offered tea and asked for the old ease that comes when a person returns to muscle memory. Rowan replied with a calendar link for a plant tour open to all families of employees, then went downstairs and watched as a trainee measured twice before a cut and smiled when it came out true. She slept better that month than in any month since she had returned to the city from the interior. She went running along the seawall on evenings when the light lasted, watching float planes lift like trout from the inlet. On Saturdays, she joined Maya at the small yard under the bridge to move boards into and out of the kiln, hands warming to routines she loved for their honesty. Not every story ends with punishment. Some end with work. But even work can taste like justice if a person has been told they do not deserve to do it. Repairs began at Coast Crown that were not cosmetic. Guards stayed on machines, meetings moved to the floor instead of the conference table, because that is where problems show themselves. Overtime sheets stopped shrinking in translation. Effluent readings began to match the seasons instead of the quarter's targets. The planed boards coming off the line felt calmer in the hand. The banding station downshifted its panic. People went home with fewer small cuts, and that mattered more to Rowan than any profile or plaque. The other shop grew in the margins, as honest work often does. They called it North Shore Grain without marketing research because the name tasted right and felt like walking up the slope in thaw. Boots slipping in roots. A violin, luthier brought a young student to the yard to watch as Rowan pulled a billet that glowed with something more than color. It glowed with patient weeks and the way sunlight remembers a tree. A cabinet maker ran fingers along a run of yellow cedar that had once leaned beside English Bay after a winter blowdown and now would become a row of doors in a kitchen that would see 3 children grow. A tiny architectural studio on the drive asked for stairs that would be quiet under bare feet and honest in the morning. None of it would make a dynasty rich, all of it would make craftspersons proud. When the fiscal year closed, the metrics did not argue with the decision the board had been forced to make, they underlined it. The company's injury rate fell to a number that made the safety poster on the wall feel less like theater. Waste dropped and margins rose without learning new words in Excel. Clients who had nearly drifted to competitors announced that they preferred a mill whose operator could explain the difference between old growth habits and second growth temperaments. The bank that had once threatened a covenant now asked for an introduction to the employee who had rerouted a process with no capital outlay and a whiteboard. Rowan did not become a different person. She kept her boots and bought a second pair of jeans that would survive belt sanders. She kept her apartment because the plum tree in the alley bore witness in spring and she liked the sound of rain on the old windows. She kept a photograph of her grandfather not on a mantle but in a drawer with a notebook and a small sharp pencil. She kept faith with Maya, who had learned that the best revenge for being told to sit down is a chair you build yourself. She learned to say no to committees that wanted her for a panel because they wanted a story they could borrow. She said yes to one school on the east side where a teacher asked if a girl with small wrists could run a saw. Rowan held up her hands and said that the point is not wrists. The family adjusted the way families do when money moves differently. Her sister found a role that involved metrics no one had to massage. Their mother discovered a charity that needed a board member with a talent for asking questions less gently than her posture suggested. Their father learned the feeling of giving a speech where people do not clap in the middle because he says what they want to hear, but at the end because the people he employs can see that he has learned to listen. He did not apologize in a way that felt like a novel. He did not need to. He changed. And that was the apology Rowan accepted. In July, the city forgot rain and turned to heat. On a Sunday, she took the SkyTrain to Metrotown and watched families shop for back-to-school supplies under cold air, then stood outside eating a paper cup of ice cream and thinking about wood. She remembered being a child in a backyard in Burnaby where her father had poured a concrete slab for a shed and her mother had planted tomatoes against the fence. She remembered the first time she had noticed the way a 2x10 cups when it dries too fast, and how a person's patience can be measured in that same curve. She laughed quietly alone in heat shimmer and thought that every good life is built of small, learned shapes. Late that summer, under the high hush of a kiln fan, she opened her grandfather's old field journal that had been tucked in a banker's box and not read since the day the boardroom finally heard what outcomes demand. The paper had the faint smell of cedar and thyme. The handwriting was the kind that men of his age had been taught in schools that called this country by different names. In it, he had written about stands of cedar above Port Renfrew and about salmon in a river near Terrace and about a worker on the line named Felix who hummed while he fed boards. He had written about his hopes for a granddaughter who did not smile for cameras but smiled at a squared edge. In one entry, he had sketched the fretboard of a guitar and written a note about how sound moves differently through wood that grew under the weight of snow. Rowan turned the page and felt a quiet so complete it seemed to be sound. On a night in September, when the first rain returned and the city exhaled, Rowan walked the length of the production floor alone after the last shift clocked out. The machines were sleeping, their metal hearts cooling, calm, their belts at rest, yom. The air felt honest again, rinsed and ready, yom. She put her palm on the fence she had aligned and thanked it for protecting a future that deserved guardianship instead of theft. Outside, the street lamps shone on wet pavement. Somewhere, a float plane came in late, lights small as sequins against the dark. And Rowan stood in a doorway of a mill she had saved with paper and patience and hands, and understood that the word legacy only means something when it is used as a verb. Her revenge had not looked like fire. It had looked like reassembly. She had not burned a house down. She had opened its windows, pulled out the wrought caille, and replaced it with cedar that would last. She had satisfied a ledger that mattered not of debits and credits, but of injuries prevented and lies retired and craft restored to the place of honor it deserves in any story about wood. Her grandfather would have approved. The city slept in rain, and in 2 shops, one large, while one small boards lay quietly, waiting to be made into something that could be touched every day by people who do not know the name of the woman who kept them honest. That anonymity felt like the purest victory of all. Rowan locked the door, slid the key into her pocket, and walked out into Vancouver's damp heart, where neon bled into wet sidewalks and the smell of cedar mixed with the smell of ocean and diesel and bread. She did not turn back to admire a building, She did not need to. The work would be there in the morning, and so would she. And that was the happiest ending a craftsperson can write.